When my phone buzzed, I was halfway through the most critical presentation of my career. It was a deal I'd been chasing for months, a merger that could push my company into the big leagues. I saw the unknown number flash on my screen, but I ignored it. I thought, nothing's more important than this right now. Fate, it seems, had other plans. The phone rang again. Same number. I silenced it. Then, a third time. By this point, the client across the table raised an eyebrow. "Something urgent?" he asked, half smiling but clearly annoyed. I apologized and excused myself, stepping out into the hallway with a polite nod. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end was one I didn't recognize. Smooth, smug, arrogant. The kind of voice that made you want to punch it without even knowing why. "David," he said, drawing out my name like we were old friends. "You don't know me, but I know you. More importantly, I know Linda. Linda, my wife." My stomach tightened. I had no idea who this guy was, but the way he said her name sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "I thought it'd be fair for you to hear it from me," he continued, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Linda's leaving you." For me, I froze. Not because I hadn't seen it coming. There had been signs, subtle but there, but because of how casually he delivered the news. Like it was a joke. "And that's not all," he added, as if he were giving me the cherry on top of this poisoned cake. "We've already sold your properties. Liquidated everything. You know, to fund our new life together. She thought it was only fair to leave you a little surprise." I leaned against the wall, gripping my phone tightly enough to crack it. Inside, a storm was brewing. Anger, hurt, betrayal. But I didn't let any of it touch my voice. "Not yet." "That's good," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Calm, cold. "Good?" he repeated, sounding confused. I could practically hear the smirk slipping off his face. "Yes," I replied. "It's good to know where things stand." I ended the call before he could say another word. I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of hearing me react. Not now. Not ever. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wall, my mind racing. The meeting, the deal, none of it mattered anymore. Not right now. My world had just shifted, and everything else faded into the background. But here's the thing about me. I don't panic. I don't lose control. When life throws me a curveball, I don't swing wildly. I wait. I calculate. And then I hit back harder than anyone expects. I straightened my tie, took a deep breath, and walked back into the conference room. My client looked up, curious. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfect," I lied, smiling as though nothing had happened. "Let's continue." Inside, though, I was already making plans. Whatever Linda and her lover thought they'd won, they had no idea who they were dealing with. When I got back to my hotel room that night, the weight of the call hit me like a freight train. My hands itched to punch something, to throw the bedside lamp, or at least pace the room until I burned through my frustration. But that wouldn't get me anywhere. No, I'm not the kind of man who reacts impulsively. I had learned long ago that control of your emotions, your surroundings, and your decisions was the key to winning in any situation. I sank into the armchair by the window, staring at the city lights below, replaying James's words over and over in my head. "Linda's leaving you. For me. We've already sold your properties." The audacity of it. My wife and this smug stranger conspiring behind my back, tearing apart everything I had built. Then came the most damning thought. How did I not see this coming? Looking back, the signs were all there. The late-night phone calls she'd take in the other room, the sudden interest in how our joint accounts were managed, and the way she had stopped asking me about my day. I'd written it off as stress, maybe boredom, but deep down, I'd known something was off. I just hadn't wanted to face it. I reached for my laptop, logging into the accounts I hadn't touched in weeks. The first thing I noticed was a glaring red flag. Withdrawals. Large ones. Not the kind that go unnoticed. I scrolled through the transaction history, my heart sinking with each new entry. $50,000 to an unlisted account. $20,000 wired overseas. Another $10,000 to a luxury retailer I didn't recognize. My stomach turned. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. Calculated, premeditated theft. She had been draining me dry, and I had been too busy with work to notice. Then there were the properties. I pulled up the deeds and documents on file. 2 of the rental properties I owned outright were no longer under my name. Sold. And judging by the timestamps on the sale documents, it had happened just days ago. I stared at the forged signature at the bottom of the forms. It looked like mine, but it wasn't. She, or more likely, James, had gone as far as to falsify my name. I felt a spark of anger ignite in my chest, but I didn't let it burn out of control. Not yet. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the one person I trusted to handle this kind of mess. Mark, my private investigator. David, he answered on the first ring. What's going on? I need you to dig into something for me, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I gave him the rundown. The stolen money, the forged documents, and the mystery man who thought he could laugh in my face. Mark didn't waste time with questions. Give me 24 hours, he said. I'll get you everything you need. After hanging up, I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. I didn't know what Mark would uncover, but I had a gut feeling that this rabbit hole went deeper than I wanted to believe. I opened a new browser tab and started doing my own research on James. His name wasn't entirely unfamiliar. I remembered Linda mentioning a work friend once or twice, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. A quick search pulled up his LinkedIn profile. He worked in finance, and judging by the grin in his profile picture, he probably thought he was clever. By the time I closed my laptop, a plan had started forming in my mind. It wasn't fully fleshed out yet, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Linda and James thought they had one. They thought I'd roll over, pack my bags, and start over like some defeated fool. But they didn't understand one thing. I don't lose. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not in my own marriage. I glanced at the city lights one last time before heading to bed, my mind already shifting into strategy mode. Tomorrow, I'd start putting the pieces in place. And when the time came, I'd make sure Linda and James felt the full weight of what they'd done. They thought this was the end of the story. They were wrong. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but now it was a controlled flame. A tool I could use to sharpen my focus, not a fire that would consume me. Linda and James thought they had outplayed me. They were wrong. I called Mark first thing. What do you have for me? I asked, skipping any pleasantries. I've got enough to confirm your suspicions, he said, his tone grave. James has been busy. He's funneled a significant portion of your money into an offshore account. Linda's name is on some of the transactions, but he's the mastermind. As for the properties, the sales were facilitated through a shady middleman. I'm pulling the paperwork now, but the forged signature is definitely his doing. Anything else? I pressed. Mark hesitated. He's been living in your house while you've been gone. I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. In my house? Your house, he confirmed. With Linda. They've been hosting dinners, entertaining guests, acting like they own the place. I let out a breath, steadying myself. It wasn't just theft. It was humiliation. They were flaunting their betrayal, parading it around like a trophy. Send me everything you've got, I said, my voice like steel. Once I had Mark's report in hand, I knew I couldn't just storm in there. That's what they'd expect. A man out of control, blinded by rage. But I don't do what's expected. I win by staying 2 steps ahead. I booked a flight home but didn't go directly to my house. Instead, I checked into a nearby hotel where I could observe them without being seen. That evening, as I parked my car a safe distance from the house, I saw them through the large bay window. James was sitting in my chair, sipping wine like he owned the place. Linda was draped over him, laughing at something he said. It was surreal, like watching a bad dream play out in slow motion. I watched for hours, taking mental notes of every detail. The way they moved around the house, the way they interacted, the way James casually opened my liquor cabinet like it was his. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a complete invasion of my life. I didn't go to them that night. I needed more time to set the stage. The next day, I met with my lawyer, Claire, who was as ruthless as they come. You want to press charges? She asked after I explained the situation. Not yet, I said. First, I need to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. This needs to be airtight. No loopholes. She nodded. Then we'll start by freezing the accounts and filing a motion to void the property sales. If they've committed forgery, those transactions won't hold up in court. Good, I said. And one more thing. Make sure the funds they transferred are flagged. I want them to feel the walls closing in before they even realize what's happening. Claire smirked. Consider it done. By the end of the day, the wheels were already in motion. The bank accounts were frozen, the property sales were under review, and I had a team of investigators combing through every detail of their scheme. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to see their reaction, to look them in the eyes and let them know their little fantasy was about to come crashing down. That night, I parked outside my house again, watching as they sat in the living room. Linda was scrolling through her phone while James poured himself another drink. They looked so comfortable, so confident, as if they'd already won. I stayed there for hours, planning my next move. I didn't just want to confront them. I wanted to dismantle everything they'd built, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. As I drove back to the hotel, a strange calm settled over me. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was mine. My home, my dignity, my life. They thought they'd outsmarted me. They thought I'd roll over and accept defeat. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Let me tell you something about foresight. It's the one thing that separates winners from losers. Months ago, when Linda started acting strange, I didn't confront her outright. Confrontation can scare people into covering their tracks. Instead, I quietly prepared for the worst. It started with the bank accounts. Linda had access to most of our finances, but I kept a few accounts separate, accounts she didn't know existed. And then, as her excuses grew flimsier and her late-night errands more frequent, I opened a new account, a decoy. The decoy account was simple. It looked like one of our joint accounts, but it wasn't. I seeded it with enough money to make it tempting, but not enough to jeopardize my actual assets. And I linked it to a tracker, an alert system that notified me every time funds were withdrawn or transferred. I didn't expect her to take the bait so quickly, but within weeks, I noticed suspicious activity. Small withdrawals at first, thousands here, thousands there. Then came the larger sums, the ones that made it obvious she wasn't just shopping for groceries. By the time James entered the picture, the account was hemorrhaging money, and I had a front row seat to every transaction. But it wasn't just about the money. I started digging into the properties we owned. Linda had always been involved in managing them, but I decided to make a few quiet changes. With the help of my lawyer, Claire, I transferred the deeds for my most valuable properties into a trust. It was a simple process, really, and completely legal. The only catch was that Linda would no longer have any authority over those properties. Not that she noticed. Now, the properties she and James had sold? Those were the decoys too. Shell corporations, fake deeds. Whatever they thought they had gotten away with wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. I remember sitting in my hotel room the night after my meeting with Claire, reviewing the final details. The trust was solid, the decoy account was drained, and my real assets were secure. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. But here's the thing about plans. They're only as good as their execution. Linda and James had no idea they were playing a game I designed. But that didn't mean I could rest easy. No, I needed to see this through to the end. The next step was timing. Mark, my private investigator, had provided a detailed report on James's offshore accounts and his connection to the forgeries. Armed with this information, I could have gone to the police right then and there. But where's the satisfaction in that? No, I wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized the truth. I wanted to watch their confidence crumble, their smugness disappear. That moment would be worth every ounce of effort. I spent the next few days laying low, watching from the sidelines as Linda and James continued their charade. They were so sure of themselves, so certain they'd outsmarted me. It was almost laughable. One evening, I watched from my car as James loaded a set of golf clubs. My golf clubs, into the back of his car. He had the nerve to stroll out of my house like he owned it, whistling as he went. Linda followed him, holding a bottle of wine she'd probably pulled from my collection. I leaned back in my seat, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I could have confronted them right then and there, but I didn't. Timing was everything, and I wasn't ready to show my hand. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention back to the plan. I called Claire again, asking her to file a motion to void the property sales. It was a formality, really. Without my signature, those transactions wouldn't hold up in court. But it was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm. The decoy account, the trust, the legal maneuvers, they were all pieces of a larger strategy. And soon, Linda and James would realize they weren't the masterminds they thought they were. They were pawns. The day I decided to confront them, I didn't just stroll into my house unannounced. No, that would have been far too predictable. I wanted to savor the moment, strategize my every word, my every move. This wasn't just about walking in and throwing accusations around. This was chess, not checkers. I arrived in the evening, just as the sun was setting. From the end of the street, my house looked the same as it always had. White picket fence, neatly trimmed lawn, porch light glowing warmly. Except it wasn't my house anymore, was it? Not in their minds. Parking my car a few blocks away, I walked toward the house with a calm I didn't entirely feel. My heart was racing, but my steps were measured, steady. As I reached the driveway, I could hear their laughter filtering through the open windows. It was lighthearted, carefree, the kind of laughter that would make you think they hadn't a worry in the world. The front door was unlocked, of course. Why wouldn't it be? They thought they had one. They thought I was miles away, licking my wounds. I stepped inside, and the smell of my favorite bourbon hit me first. The audacity. They'd opened the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. The living room was filled with the kind of warmth you'd expect in a happy home. Except this wasn't a happy home. This was a crime scene, and the criminals were sitting on my couch. James was the first to notice me. He was sprawled across the cushions, feet propped up on my coffee table, a glass of my bourbon in his hand. For a split second, his face froze, the smugness replaced by something almost resembling fear. But then he recovered, flashing me that insufferable grin I'd come to despise. "Well, well," he said, raising his glass as if to toast me. "Look who decided to come home." Linda turned to face me, her smile faltering as she registered the look in my eyes. She opened her mouth, probably to say something clever or dismissive, but I didn't give her the chance. "I hope you've been enjoying yourselves," I said, my tone as calm as ever. "Because the party's over." James chuckled, leaning back as if this was all some big joke. "Oh, come on, David. Let's not be dramatic. You've had a good run, but it's time to let someone else take the reins." I ignored him, my eyes fixed on Linda. "Is this how you wanted it to end? Sneaking around, lying, stealing?" She looked away, guilt flickering across her face, but she said nothing. James, ever the showman, decided to interject. "You can't blame her for wanting more, David. You've been so busy with your work, you barely noticed her. Or your money, for that matter." I let him talk. The more he rambled, the more confident he became, and the more satisfying it would be to watch that confidence crumble. "Here's the thing," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "You didn't win. You never even stood a chance." That got his attention. The grin slipped, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" he asked, sitting up straighter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folder, dropping it onto the coffee table. Inside were copies of the forged documents, transaction records, and a detailed timeline of their scheme. "This," I said, tapping the folder, "is everything I need to take you down. Forgery, fraud, theft, you name it." James glanced at the folder, then back at me. His face was pale now, his bravado evaporating. "You're bluffing," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Do you think the police will see it that way? Or the courts?" Linda finally spoke, her voice trembling. "David, please. Let's talk about this. We can fix it." "Fix it?" I echoed, laughing humorlessly. "You don't get to fix anything, Linda. Not after what you've done." James stood up, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Sit down," I snapped, cutting him off. "This isn't your house. It never was. And by the time I'm done with you, it won't even be your freedom." He hesitated, then sank back into the couch, his bravado completely gone. I straightened, taking a moment to let the silence hang heavy in the air. Enjoy the last bit of comfort you'll have for a while. Because tomorrow, your world comes crashing down. I turned and walked out, leaving them to stew in their panic. Outside, the night air felt cool against my skin, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. The pieces were in place. The next move was mine, and I intended to make it count. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The wheels were already in motion, and now it was time to push things to the point of no return. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to dismantle everything they had built, slowly, painfully, completely. The first step was freezing the accounts. Claire, my lawyer, had already filed the necessary paperwork, and by mid-morning, the funds James had siphoned off were officially untouchable. Whatever dreams he and Linda had of using my money to start a new life were now as empty as their morality. I got a call from Claire just as I was finishing my coffee. The banks confirmed it, she said, her tone clipped and professional. The accounts are frozen, and the offshore transfers are flagged for fraud investigation. They won't be able to access a single penny. Good, I said, leaning back in my chair. What about the properties? We've filed a motion to void the sales, she replied. With the evidence of forgery, it's only a matter of time before the courts rule in your favor. Legally, those properties still belong to you. Perfect, I said. After hanging up, I felt a small, satisfied smile creep onto my face. Linda and James were about to discover what it felt like to lose everything. I decided it was time for the next step, delivering the blow personally. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about watching their smug confidence crumble in real time. I drove to the house that afternoon, this time with purpose. When I walked through the door, I found them exactly where I expected. James in the living room, pacing like a caged animal, and Linda sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. What the hell did you do? James snapped the moment he saw me. I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't play dumb, he spat. The bank froze our accounts. We can't access anything? Our accounts? I repeated, smirking. You mean my accounts? And yes, I had them frozen. It's funny how theft tends to catch up with you. Linda looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. David, please, let's talk about this. We can work something out. Work something out? I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. You mean like how you worked out forging my signature? Or how you worked out selling my properties behind my back? She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might actually cry. But then James stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You think you're so clever, he sneered. Freezing the accounts doesn't change anything. The properties are already sold. We'll get the money one way or another. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that made him take a step back. You really don't get it, do you? Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a stack of documents and tossed them onto the coffee table. Those sales? They're void. The properties were transferred into a trust weeks ago. Legally, they were never yours to sell. James snatched up the papers, his eyes scanning them frantically. As he read, the color drained from his face. No, he muttered, shaking his head. This can't be right. Oh, it's right, I said, my tone calm but firm. You thought you could steal from me, but all you've done is dig your own grave. Every transaction, every forged document, it's all been documented. And now it's in the hands of the authorities. Linda's voice broke through the silence, trembling with desperation. David, please. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. I turned to her, my expression cold. You made your choices, Linda. You betrayed me, lied to me, and tried to ruin me. There's no coming back from that. James slammed the papers down on the table, his face twisted in fury. You think you've won? This isn't over. No, it's not, I agreed, stepping closer to him. But not for the reasons you think. You're going to jail, James. Fraud, forgery, theft. It's all going to catch up with you. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could get a word out, the sound of sirens filled the air. I smiled, taking a step back. right on time. Moments later, the police knocked on the door. I watched as James was handcuffed, his protests falling on deaf ears. Linda wasn't arrested, at least not yet, but the look of sheer panic on her face was enough for me. As they led James out of the house, he shot me a venomous glare. "You'll regret this," he hissed. I met his gaze, unflinching. "The only thing I regret is letting you two get this far." When the door closed behind them, I stood there in the silence, taking it all in. The house was mine again, but it didn't feel like home. Not yet. That would come later. For now, I had the satisfaction of knowing I'd turned the tables. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that the fall is always more painful when it's from a great height. For Linda and James, that height was the illusion of victory they had so arrogantly constructed for themselves. I had no intention of letting them fall in private. No, their betrayal deserved an audience. The morning after James's arrest, I sent out an email to a carefully curated list. Neighbors, mutual friends, Linda's colleagues, and even a few of James's business associates. The subject line was simple: a matter of truth. The email contained a brief summary of their scheme. Just the facts, no embellishments, along with scanned copies of the forged documents and bank transactions. I didn't add any personal commentary. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Within hours, my phone buzzed with messages. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to express their shock, their sympathy. Neighbors who had always waved politely from across the street were now texting me paragraphs about how they never trusted Linda or always thought James seemed shady. It was fascinating, really, how quickly people turned on them. But this wasn't just about gossip, it was about reclaiming my narrative. They had tried to make me a victim in silence. I was making them villains in the spotlight. Later that day, I took a walk around the neighborhood. It wasn't long before I encountered the first wave of onlookers. Mrs. Bennett, who lived 2 houses down, practically sprinted across her yard to intercept me. "David!" she exclaimed, clutching her pearls like she was in some kind of soap opera. "I can't believe what those two did to you. And Linda, I thought she was such a sweet girl. How could she?" I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," I said with a tight smile. "But I'd rather not discuss it right now." She nodded, her eyes wide with what I could only describe as morbid curiosity. Of course. But if you need anything at all, you just let me know." As I continued walking, I noticed curtains twitching in windows, neighbors peeking out from behind their blinds. The entire street seemed to buzz with the news. When I returned home, I found Linda on the porch, pacing like a trapped animal. She looked disheveled, a far cry from the polished, confident woman she'd been just days ago. "David," she started, her voice shaky, "I need to talk to you." I crossed my arms, leaning against the porch railing. "Talk about what?" She glanced around nervously, her eyes darting toward the street where a few neighbors had gathered in small clusters. "Not here," she whispered. "Inside. Anything you need to say to me, you can say right here," I replied, my voice steady. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might actually cry. "Please," she begged, lowering her voice. "They're all watching." "That's the least of your worries," I said coldly. At that moment, a car pulled up to the curb. It was James's sister, Claire, who had apparently come to retrieve some of his belongings. She stepped out of the car, her face set in a grim mask, and marched up the driveway. "I can't believe this," Claire spat, glaring at Linda. "You said you had everything under control. Now James is in jail, and your entire life is falling apart." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Claire cut her off, turning to me instead. "This is your doing, isn't it?" I smiled faintly. James did this to himself. All I did was ensure there were consequences. Claire scoffed, but before she could say anything else, one of the neighbors, a man named Greg, stepped onto my lawn. "You know," he said loudly, addressing no one in particular, "it's one thing to cheat. It's another thing entirely to steal from your own husband." Linda's face went pale as more neighbors started chiming in. "I always thought something was off about her," one woman said. "And him too," added another. "Always acting like he was better than everyone else." The humiliation on Linda's face was almost enough to make me feel pity for her. Almost. "David," she said again, her voice breaking, "please, just let me explain." I straightened, meeting her gaze with cold detachment. "There's nothing left to explain, Linda. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." I walked past her, ignoring the whispers and murmurs of the crowd, and stepped inside my house. It didn't feel like home yet, but it was getting there. As I closed the door, I heard Claire snapping at Linda, neighbors gossiping openly, and Linda's voice breaking into sobs. It was messy, it was public, and it was exactly what they deserved. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. They had tried to humiliate me, to destroy me, but in the end, the only ones left in ruins were them. After the chaos of the past few days, the quiet was almost disconcerting. The neighbors had retreated to their own lives. The gossiping texts and calls had slowed, and the legal wheels were now turning steadily in my favor. The police were handling James, and Linda was too busy trying to salvage whatever scraps of her reputation she could to bother me anymore. For the first time in weeks, I had a moment to sit in my house, the same house I'd fought so hard to reclaim, and just breathe. The air felt different, cleaner, somehow. Like the toxicity that had festered here during Linda and James's takeover had finally been purged. Still, there was work to be done. My lawyer, Claire, had set up a meeting to discuss the next steps. The properties James and Linda had sold were well on their way to being legally voided, and the funds they tried to transfer offshore had been flagged and were frozen indefinitely. Once the court finalizes the ruling, Claire told me during our meeting, "You'll have full control over all assets again. James will be facing several felony charges, and Linda, well, she's in a tricky spot. There's enough evidence to implicate her, but since she didn't physically forge the documents, she may get off lightly." "That's fine," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I don't care about punishing her anymore. I just want her out of my life." Claire nodded, jotting down notes. "Understood. Have you decided whether you want to pursue divorce proceedings now or wait until the criminal case against James is settled?" "Now," I said firmly. "The sooner, the better." Once the paperwork was filed, I shifted my focus to something I'd been neglecting for far too long, myself. I'd spent so much energy fighting Linda and James, so much time consumed by their betrayal, that I'd almost forgotten who I was before all this started. I began reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in years. People who had drifted away during my marriage to Linda, either because she didn't like them or because I'd been too busy trying to make her happy to notice. It felt good to rekindle those relationships, to remember what it was like to laugh with people who genuinely cared about me. Work became my refuge again. The merger I'd been pursuing before James's call had gone through, and now my company was thriving in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every day felt like a step forward, a reminder that I was capable of building something great without anyone's help, and certainly without anyone's sabotage. And then there was the house. For weeks, it had felt like a battleground, a place tainted by memories of Linda's betrayal. But slowly, I began reclaiming it. I replaced the furniture she'd chosen with pieces that felt more like me. I repainted the walls, re-landscaped the yard, even adopted a dog, a golden retriever named Max, who quickly became my most loyal companion. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with Max at my feet, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Linda and James had tried to destroy me, but all they'd done was show me who I could be without them. Stronger, smarter, happier. Of course, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when the anger resurfaced, when I thought about everything they'd stolen. Not just money and property, but trust, time, and a version of my life that I would never get back. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself that I was moving forward. Linda, on the other hand, wasn't. I'd heard through the grapevine that she was struggling to find a place to live, her reputation in shambles after the truth of her betrayal became public. James, of course, was still behind bars, awaiting trial. And while part of me wanted to gloat, I resisted the urge. They weren't worth my energy anymore. Instead, I focused on building a life that was mine, free from their influence. I started traveling again, something I hadn't done since before my marriage. I took Max on road trips, exploring places I'd always wanted to see but never had the time for. It wasn't a perfect life. Not yet, but it was mine, and that was enough. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail. It was from Claire, containing the finalized divorce papers and a note congratulating me on officially closing that chapter of my life. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the good stuff, the bottle I'd been saving, and raised it in a silent toast to myself. To starting over, I said aloud, letting the words settle in the quiet of the room. And just like that, I felt lighter. It was a crisp fall evening when the past decided to show up on my doorstep one last time. I had just finished walking Max around the block and was settling into my favorite chair with a glass of bourbon when the doorbell rang. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Whoever it was could wait. But something told me to get up, so I did. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Linda standing there. Her once polished appearance was gone, replaced by a tired, haggard look. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled, and the confident woman who had once laughed at my expense was nowhere to be seen. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her choices. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Talk? About what?" She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. "About everything. I made mistakes. Big ones. I see that now." I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch between us. Max sat at my feet, his tail wagging lazily as if even he could sense the tension. Finally, I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "You've got 5 minutes." Linda stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room as though she expected to find someone else there. Once she sat on the couch, she looked at me with a mix of desperation and regret. "I'm sorry, David," she began. "For everything. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it. I thought James and I could build a better life, but he wasn't who I thought he was." I raised an eyebrow. "And it took you this long to figure that out?" Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway. I've lost everything, my reputation, my stability, my future. I don't know where else to turn." I studied her for a moment, trying to decipher if her words were genuine or if this was just another act. Either way, it didn't matter. I had moved on, and there was no room for her in the life I was rebuilding. "I appreciate the apology, Linda," I said finally, "but forgiveness doesn't mean going back to how things were. You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the months of betrayal, the nights she had spent with James while I was out working to provide the life she so casually destroyed. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't have anywhere else to go." I took a sip of my bourbon, letting the warmth spread through me before I replied. "That's not my problem, Linda. You burned this bridge the moment you decided to betray me." She stared at me, the tears now streaming down her face. "Please, David. Just give me one more chance. I'll do whatever it takes." I shook my head, standing up and walking toward the door. "No, Linda. You'll have to figure this out on your own. And for what it's worth, I hope you do." She followed me to the door, her desperation growing. "David." "Goodbye, Linda," I said firmly, opening the door and motioning for her to leave. As she stepped outside, I noticed a few of the neighbors watching from their windows. Linda hesitated on the porch, as if hoping I'd change my mind, but I didn't. I closed the door without another word, shutting her out for good. Later that evening, I received a text from Claire. The court had officially ruled in my favor, voiding the fraudulent property sales and restoring everything to my name. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last loose end tied up. Linda and James had taken their shot, but they had lost, completely and irrevocably. As I sat back in my chair, Max curled up at my feet, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the anger, the humiliation. It had all led to this moment. A moment where I could finally breathe, knowing that I had come out stronger. Raising my glass, I toasted to the future. "To starting over," I said quietly, letting the words settle in the stillness of the room. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.